we're going to get started. We will have you out in time for Mass, don't worry. Most everyone in here, I think, is a parishioner, but for a couple guests, I work in the chapel of Tim Severn, social mission director there. And tonight we're hearing Jack Jezreel. He's the founder of Just Faith Ministries, which Bellarmine has a really long relationship with, over 20 years, over 120 grads of the program. And we're at a point where we're ready to renew that commitment and put more grads out into the world to get more of our social mission front and center. So this sort of talk tonight has two purposes, I guess. The first is that, to recruit for our Just Faith groups, but I think more generally, as Jack will share, it's really for us to think about how we as a parish can live out our social mission more actively in the world. The other piece, I'll let Jack introduce himself, but I said this in the morning, I'll say it again here. In his bio, he's called the Johnny Appleseed of the Catholic Social Mission, going throughout the country, spreading the good word, so I will let him spread that good word with us.
What that means is I've been in a lot of church basements over the last year. Well, thanks for making time tonight. And just by way of a quick introduction, when I was a student, I for 4 years as an undergrad studied theology, and then got my Master of Divinity degree from Notre Dame, which is a 3-year program. So I spent 7 years really sitting around a table studying theology. And then within a year after I finished my master's degree, I spent 6 years in a Catholic worker community. And for those who are not familiar, just the Cliff Notes version is we worked and lived and celebrated, and we became part of the community of those who'd been sort of disposed of on the streets. And so most of our work is working with homeless men and women and children. The way my quick summary of those first 13 years after high school was I spent 7 years studying theology around a table, which in a kind of a formal theological setting, and it was a tremendous gift to me. And then I spent 6 years studying theology on the street. And the wonderful kind of synthesis of those two things. So, for example, the 7 years of studying theology formally in a classroom really prepared me for interpreting what I would experience later on in some of the poorest parts of the city I was living in. But also, the experience of living and working with those who were impoverished and abandoned and marginalized helped me reinterpret what had happened in those first 7 years. And I just feel like it was such a remarkable gift, that juxtaposition of those 13 years. In many ways, the rest of my life has been trying to provide something like that experience in an available form that doesn't require that you quit your job and go get a master's degree, or go live in the Amazon for the next 5 years. So it's really the original program, Just Faith, was the effort to provide something that was intellectually substantive, that was long enough to provide people with a robust opportunity to explore and dig into the tradition a bit. It was intended to build relationships so that at the end of the process, people would have a little beehive to be part of, to get work started, because ultimately the church is not about solo acts. It's what we can do together, and that's what brings hope and strength and possibility, even in situations that are very despairing, right? The church sometimes is at its best when people are exploited and oppressed, exactly because we have to bring ourselves together. And so the little piece that Tim didn't tell you was I formally stepped down from my position with Just Faith Ministries as of the end of last year, because I'd been doing this for a long time. I'm still on the board of directors. And one of the reasons I stay on the board, and one of the reasons I'm glad to be back here, is that I'll just share this little piece. When we started Just Faith, it got popular so fast, and it grew so fast, that I was sure that some big company or organization was going to try to, we were just like a 2-person office, and our work was just exploding meteorically. And I just thought, well, somebody with a lot of money, some publisher with a lot of money is going to come and going to print the glossy, fancy version of this, and then I'll be out of a job, right? And I wouldn't have really minded that too much, but it never happened. And that kind of surprised me, because the stack of testimonies of how people have significantly, in some cases, dramatically changed their lives, and are doing things that not only impacted the life of their local faith community, but the places where they were working. And you know, if only we had until midnight, I would just tell you story after story. Well, let's just do it. No. So I just was sure someone would just say, well, you know, that guy from Louisville, he got it partly right, but we could do a better job. But it never happened. And so the reality is, I don't know how else to say this, because it sounds like I'm just doing gross self-promotion. But the reality is, I don't know of another program that you can do in your parish that has the same kind of impact in terms of, if you will, this is one way to say it, deflecting the trajectory of people's lives into the direction of our brothers and sisters in harm's way. I just haven't found anything else that works as well. And I wish the opposite were true. I mean, not that I mind, you know, promoting just faith, but I mean just that I'm just surprised. And so in the meantime, it's what we got, and it's pretty good. And there are a lot of, how many people in the room have been through one version or another of one of our programs? And you know, it's just been a pleasure over the years to hear the stories of people who talk about this deepening and widening, grounding experience that deepened their faith, made them more committed to their faith because they now recognized its implications and its opportunities. And one way to say this, sometimes when we talk about social ministry, you know, if somebody says, you want to go to the soup kitchen, and the image you get is like, not really, you know, I'd rather, you know, but I think one of the things that we have successfully been able to communicate in the course of the program is that this is really about abundant life, meaning that our lives spent committing ourselves to each other's good is a very, very rich life. And that people discover in some ways themselves in the course of giving themselves away, which is utterly different than in some ways collecting and keeping and gathering and, you know, and accumulating and all the rest. And they bring very different kinds of experiences to us. And so all that's just to say that I'm glad to be back. Thank you for coming tonight. And I'm going to try to speak a little bit to that, but really in some ways I've got a sort of a bigger narrative to tell tonight. And it's really in some ways about why it is that something like Just Faith exists, and why it is that in many churches, it's still tough to communicate the privilege, that's the word I would use, the privilege it is to be a vessel of God's healing presence in the world. You know, I just heard somebody say this the other last week, actually. They were talking about, now, if you want to make sure that you only get 3 people to show up for a talk, just put the word social mission or social justice in the title. And that will make sure that everybody has plenty of cookies, right? Because very few people will show up. And why is that? Why is that in a faith tradition in which, you know, the Messiah is a guy who spends most of his time with who? The ones left behind, right? The ones that have been abandoned, the poor, the leper, the ones that the rest of the culture eyes suspiciously. Despite the fact that our Gospels are nothing but filled with these testimonies, why is it that the Christian community, by and large, at least the Catholic community that I know best, has by and large found it kind of compelling to sort of make sure I don't get too close to that stuff? And there's actually, I think, a reason. And that's what I kind of want to speak to tonight, by way of encouragement, by way of, in some way, celebrating what's happened at this particular parish. By the way, how many here are members of this parish? So mostly everybody, almost, except our 2 Episcopalian friends. So it's like being, it's like being, flowers in the middle of the onion patch. But anyway, it's okay. So this parish has done such wonderful things, and this Jesuit parish, I think like you, probably like me, celebrates a Jesuit pope right? Who is saying a lot of things that you probably recognize better than most parishes, exactly because of the Jesuit influence in the community. And I want to speak to that influence. And in some ways, my purpose here is, I don't think anything I'm going to say is probably going to challenge you. What I hope it will be is to celebrate you and in some ways encourage perhaps even more creativity. Because one of the things we're going to find out tonight is that our Pope is begging us in some ways to reimagine what it means to be a Catholic community. And quite frankly, as you know, when the Pope writes now, he's kind of inviting a larger conversation, not just among Catholics, but amongst Christians generally, and even beyond the Christian community. And of course, Laudato Si, what does it mean for us, all of us, to apply our religious traditions, whatever religious tradition you come to thinking about what's the sustainable model going forward, so that our grandchildren have a life. Right? I mean, that's really the purpose of Laudato Si in some ways, is how can we imagine, how can we craft our lives together so that our grandchildren have access to the same wonders, the same awe, the same opportunity to live a full and rich human life that we've enjoyed, right? And so all this is just to say that I think the Pope has this big embrace. And but at least for those of us for you who come from this parish, I think there's an opportunity to think in some ways no holds barred about what does it mean to be a people of faith going forward. And so that's part of what I want to speak to tonight. So the frame I want to use is really a frame provided by Pope Francis, and that is that we're in the middle of this huge transition. The transition, this is going to surprise you, I think. The transition is from Vatican I to Vatican II. The Pope's impression, the Pope's very strong sense of this, is that what Vatican II what Vatican II brought was, in his words, a nudging of the Spirit. And that nudging of the Spirit is still happening because Vatican II has not been completed. Now, I'll just say this, that about 2 or 3 years ago, the Pope was having an audience with the Catholic press, and one of the journalists said, Pope Francis, what are you up to? I mean, like, what is your big plan here? And he didn't even hesitate for a second. He said, I'd like to complete Vatican II. And some of the guys there, some of the journalists there said, well, that's 50 years ago, right? And the Pope says, yes, but it's, things happen in the church sort of slowly. And this is what he's got in mind. And I will say this, that as I have traveled around the country, and in some ways as I've traveled around the country, I often will speak on a Sunday like today, and I'll very frequently attend liturgy, and I always pick up a bulletin. And sometimes when I pick up a bulletin, it'll say something like this: St. Mary's Catholic Church, and then underneath there's a subtitle that says, a Vatican II community. I think, oh, really? Well, this is great! So I pick up the bulletin, which sometimes is like the Sunday edition of the New York Times, right? I mean, some of these things are just enormous now. You think what their printing cost, anyway. So I'm eager to see the Vatican II community, right? So I'm paging through, and I get to the last page, I put it down and said, not a Vatican II community, a Vatican I.5 community. And I actually mean that. Just, I think, exactly like the Pope means it. And so here's my argument. How many of you are old enough, like me, to remember something about Vatican I? You remember the pre-Vatican II church, right? And so we had this memory and this experience, and one of the ways that the Vatican, I mean, this is the only way to say it. At the time, we didn't say we were the Vatican I church, we were just a church, right? But one of the ways the church communicated, if you will, itself to its members was through an education tool that was used from about 1890 to the 1970s, and every Catholic in the United States bumped into it in one way or the other, either in grade school, middle school, high school, or if they were becoming Catholic because they were marrying a Catholic, they learned it sooner or later, and that tool was called Baltimore Catechism. And for those of you who are too young or from another tradition, the Baltimore Catechism was like a long a litany of short questions with a long litany of short answers. Sometimes too short, quite frankly. They weren't, in many ways, robust, in some cases, enough for adult thinking. But anyway, it's what it was. And all of us, just about all of us my age, and a little bit younger and older, basically learned what it meant to be Catholic through the Baltimore Catechism, and then in some ways the practice of the Baltimore Catechism in our parishes. And how many of you, is there anybody here who thinks you remember the Baltimore Catechism really, really well? Like you can even remember answers? Yeah. Okay, what was the answer to question 85?
Ask me who is God.
Well, who is God, by the way?
God is a supreme being, infinitely perfect, who made all things and keeps them in existence.
So, it's working, right? So, well, that's not exactly the question I was going to ask, but it's fun. Thank you. That was great fun. But the question that is asked and I don't even know if it is question 85, but the big one that I'm interested in is this one question, which was, why did Christ institute the church? Now, really, the question was, what is the purpose of church? What's the reason for its being? What does it do? What's it trying to accomplish? What's its activity? Okay? In fact, what is its ministry? So here's the answer that was given. And probably when I click this up there, some of you will remember. It's a three-infinitive phrase. Three-infinitive phrase, excuse me. Infinitive phrase. And the church's work, the church's reason for being, was to teach, to govern, and to sanctify. Is that remember?
Yeah.
No, let's try that again. Anybody remember that?
Yeah.
I'm actually trying to fit a 3-hour talk into 1 hour, so I'm talking as fast as I can talk. This is, the answer that was given. Now, one of the reasons, I just came back, well, not just came back. Last summer I was part of a big conference at the University of Notre Dame, theologians from all over the country, talking about Vatican II, the celebration of the 50th anniversary. And the same two themes kept on coming up in everybody's talk. And those are the two themes I want to talk about here. There are two questions that Vatican II asks, if you will, Vatican I, and comes up with very different answers. And this is why we see this sort of transition from Vatican I to Vatican II. And the two questions that Vatican II asks and answers differently, the first one is, if the church's work really is to teach, to govern, and to sanctify, who actually does the teaching, the governing, and the sanctifying? And think about the 1962 church, if you will. Who did this work? Priests. No, priests. Now, this is not a criticism of priests. That's the last thing it is, because many priests did wonderful work. In fact, one of the movies I've seen recently that really does a wonderful job of translating part of what priests did in the, let's say, the 1940s, 50s. Did any of you see the movie Brooklyn?
Yeah.
It's a beautiful movie. I mean, it's just a lovely movie. But in it, there's one of the supporting characters is a priest, and the role he served, and many priests did in this country, was helping immigrants, transition into a very different world, helping them get education, helping them find jobs, keeping a neighborhood together. That's why you have the Hungarian church next to the Italian church, next to the German church, because they spoke a common language, and the priests sort of kept this thing together because, as you might remember, Catholics were eyed very suspiciously in this culture. I mean, it was very important. But anyway, the point is, there was a lot of good work happening by the local. So this is not an anti-clerical comment. But here's the problem, says Vatican II. If less than 1% of the church are the agents of active ministry, in other words, teaching, governing, doing it, then the other 99% are the ones being ministered to. No, there's nothing wrong with being ministered to, but the problem is, if that's all you do, then your role is primarily passive. Right? So your identity as a person of faith, well, think about this. When we talk about a holy day of obligation, what was the obligation? Show up so you can be ministered to. There was no active ingredient in the commitment, in the obligation. Are you with me? You see? So, however, Vatican II looks at the data, if you will, sometimes we call it the scriptures, church history and theology, and comes up with a very different conclusion. Who ought to be ministering? And the answer is not just those who have been ordained, but those who receive the sacrament of baptism. Which means who's called to do ministry?
All of us.
Everybody. Now, here's the good news. 50 years since Vatican II. And for those of you who can remember what your church bulletin looked like in 1966, in August of 1966, exactly 50 years ago today, what did the church bulletin look like? Mass times, confession times, altar society times, and that was about it. In other words, the bulletin, in some cases, was negligible. Now, you've got what? The Sunday edition of the New York Times. And in it, there are 148 ministries happening. And guess who started most of them? The baptized. Who populates them all? The baptized. Who organizes them? The baptized. Now, this is the truth. So, in the last maybe 10 years, I've noticed a brand new phenomenon in the building in Catholic parishes. And this is just amazing. So I go to a parish, and they'll say, we got this big building project, and of course that's very familiar to churches, right? Yeah. But this is the strange piece. They're not building a new worship center. They're not building a school. Guess what they're building? Meeting space. Because there's so many meetings, these 146, they meet every night, and there's just not, so they're actually building meeting space. Well, that just speaks to the beehive, doesn't it? So far, so good. Now, here is the problem. There's a second question that Vatican II asked of Vatican I, again, about this definition. And by the way, this is one way to talk about it. I use this sort of as a Cliff Notes version, this teaching, governing, and sanctifying, because it just works. It paints the picture using a single brush. But the second question that Vatican II asked about this definition of ministry is not who, but it actually asks about the geography. If ministry is defined by teaching, governing, and sanctifying, where physically does that actually happen? And the answer, is on parish property, right? Now let me give you a little snapshot of Jack. 1966, so this is 50 years, 10 years old, okay? And I'm just going to give you the experience of a Catholic boy being Catholic at 10 years old, and how this so informs how we think about, I think, ourselves and our church. So it's Sunday morning, and my brothers and sisters, we all climb out of bed, get ready for church. We hop in, we go out to the driveway, and we hop in our station wagon. Remember station wagons?
Yes.
They're football fields on four wheels. And it felt like that not only because they were big, but there were no seat belts. So you got to climb all over the place. And so my brothers and sister and I, we would take our youngest sister and we would pitch her from middle seat to the back seat to the middle seat. It's chaos, pandemonium, and tumult. So we pull out of the driveway, we go down, and it's just like, a monkey ranch in the back of the station wagon. And and it's pandemonium past the high school, pandemonium past the Dairy Queen, and then all of us went to St. Cecilia's Catholic School. And because we all went to St. Cecilia's Catholic School, we were all taught by nuns. The nanosecond that the right front tire touched the church parking lot, then it was immediately and there we stood, quiet, because this is the way it happened. And we would open the doors, my brothers and sisters, we'd get out in a single file, and walk toward the church behind our parents, and then the door would open. And the first thing that would happen, remember 10-year-old Jack, you're looking like, this is so cool, right? Colored light that you never seen. None of my friends had stained glass windows in their house, not a one. And so there was this odd light, right? And then you walk in, and then of course during this thing that happens called the Mass, we only speak in a language that no one understands. We all know why. It's because God only speaks Latin. And then we had this unusual experience of prayer, which was probably not very helpful, where, at least in our church, when you got on the kneelers and you were a young boy, you had to hang on to the pew in order not to sort of fall over. And it wasn't very comfortable. And you thought, I'm not sure I'm going to do this prayer thing after I don't have to. Anyway, it was odd. And then, of course, then during liturgy, and there's colored light, and there's strange languages, and then there's smoke, which was really cool because we never got to have smoke in our house. So there was smoke coming from the altar, and I would say, Mom, can we have smoke in our house? No. So only happens at church. And then also what we noticed is when you go to this block called the school and the parish, there are men who wear black, there are women who wear black and very odd headdresses. And it only happens on the block. Now, I lived in Clearwater Beach. We never saw people in black at the beach. They were just on this parish block. They weren't anywhere. They didn't go to the mall. Of course, there wasn't really a mall then. They weren't at the grocery. They weren't at the department stores. They were only on the block. And then, after Mass, we would all march back quietly to our station wagon, get in the car, and wait. And the minute the left front tire touched the road, which meant we were off the parish block, it was back to throwing my sister back and forth over the seats. Back to, and this is the point, normal life. What it meant to be Catholic had something to do with this block. And it was particularly holy, this block. It had holy people, it had holy events, it had holy language. It was all completely different than anything else that happened off the block. You see my point? You see? And so Vatican II suggests that ministry is not just limited to the block, but it happens everywhere. And one of the most powerful statements of this happens near the end of liturgy, in the Catholic liturgy, where the presider says this spiritually powerful, theologically potent word, and that spiritually powerful word is go. Go. Now, not go, it's time to vacuum. Like go because our staff wants to go home. It's go because it's a sending rite. And it's this: having broken bread, having shared this cup, having experienced the presence of the living Lord amongst us, there's only one thing to be done, and that is to be ourselves a vessel of God's hope and healing presence in the world. So go and get to work. Do it, right? So let's just pretend like the altar is up here, and we're told to go, so we turn around, and for the last hour, our lives have been sort of governed by the assumptions of common prayer. Right? So we know when to kneel and sit and stand. We know what the responses to the prayers are. We know how to get in the communion line. We know how to be together for this hour. And it's good because it's good to have the common prayer. It's not, you don't want people kneeling and sitting and standing all at the same time and doing all sorts of... So, this notion of orchestration and the body of Christ doing things together, it's all very powerful. But, so we turn around in this last hour, and we head to the exit doors, and maybe as you get to the exit door, if you're of this mind, you might pause for just a second. You think, back to the station wagon, back to family, back to the neighborhood, back to my job. And then let me just add this 2016 reality, right? Back to a world of politics, economics, back to a world where, 1 billion people on this planet live on less than $1 a day. Back to a world in which one of the largest industries and growing is human trafficking. Back to a world, back to a country, the wealthiest that the world has ever known, in which 1 in 5 children live with food insecurity and don't know if they will have a meal tomorrow in this country. Back to a world, and all you have to do, newspaper of choice, read the first 3 pages, and know of the many wounds that plague this human family. And that, in the name of Jesus, part of what we're sent to. And as you pause at the door, you realize knowing when to stand, kneel, and sit isn't going to help me a whole lot do that. Right? So we need, in some ways, a formation that not only helps us pray together for the hour, but then helps, in some way, send us together so that we can be this transforming presence of hope and possibility and new light and salt and leaven for the world. And we need in some ways to be equipped beyond just the hour we spend together, but equipped to live that life out there so we can raise children with big hearts, for example, so we can be neighbors who bring presence and love. That we be a people who are engaged politically in a way that brings life to the world, and it's not just about my self-interest and my own pocketbook. We need to be transformed in a way that we can be Christ in the world, right? Mother Teresa says, you are the hands and the feet, and that's what we are called to be. But the reality is that, quite frankly, most parishes have not focused their attention on how to empower. So what Pope Francis, when Pope Francis talks about the completion of Vatican II, the hope is that we'll have churches of baptized people, all of them going where? Everywhere. In other words, engaged in the world. And then, of course, coming back at least every Sunday to celebrate life shared, life broken, life given, right? And so that's the vision. Now, here's the bad news. Remember the churches with 148 ministries going on? Guess, this is a big brushstroke, but guess how many of them happen on parish property? 146. Or some. I mean, I'm making a big brushstroke, and I feel safe in saying that, especially here, because I know it's not true of this parish. But you see the picture. You get the snapshot, right? And then we go back to those 148. Guess how many of those ministries are focused on the parish itself? Well, probably the same 146, right? In other words, the ministries tend to be self-directed. Now, that doesn't mean they're a bad thing. It just means they're incomplete. Okay, and I'm going to talk more about that in just a second. Are you with me? So the vision that Pope Francis has is, how do we empower parishes who are in some ways engaged out there? And just to sort of make the point, I've selected 5 texts from the Pope's first formal statement, which was his apostolic letter called Joy of the Gospel. And I've got 5 texts that I think are going to knock your socks off. They're just so exciting and also challenging. But so could I have maybe a woman's voice read this first one? These are all texts from Evangelii Gaudium. And so is there a woman with a strong voice who could read the first one for us? Yes, ma'am.
I want to emphasize that what I am trying to express here has a programmatic significance and important consequences. I hope that all communities will devote the necessary effort to advancing along the path of a pastoral and missionary conversion, which cannot leave things as they presently are.
You might not see this, but I very subtly highlighted a few words. And I highlighted it exactly for the point. The Pope is hoping for something different. Now, this is in a section that's focused on parish life. So what he's looking for is a change that will not leave things as they presently are. And what I find interesting is that very seldom, when popes issue statements, they're typically theological vision statements, but they don't usually say, and I expect programmatic implementation. That's very unusual. That the Pope's writing something that says, I'm giving you a little bit of a manual here, but that is a strange way for a Pope to write. So he thinks he's writing something that people are going to take seriously. That was supposed to be fun. Anyway, so I just want to give you one a key word here, because in the Pope Francis lexicon, this is the biggie. Okay, and the biggie is this word missionary. Francis's favorite way of talking about the baptized is missionary disciples. He wants every baptized person to identify as a missionary disciple. Now, what the heck is that? Okay, and that's what I'm going to tell you. This word missionary actually has many different kinds of meanings, even in the history of the church. But in the South American Jesuit intellectual tradition, it has a very specific meaning. And here's what it means to a South American Jesuit theologian. And missionary here speaks to, and it's connected with something that's also popular in the South American lexicon called encuentro. Anybody heard the word encuentro before? It means encounter. Okay, so these things, encounter and missionary conversion, are connected. So here's what it means. Another way of talking about missionary, in this case, or missionary disciples, is the whole notion of, and I'll use this phrase if it helps, voluntary displacement. So that means, so like this is my hometown, like this is my home community that supports me, that loves me, that I'm connected to, and voluntary displacement, a la the gospel, asks me to sort of pick up and move to another community and plop, that's a technical theological term, plop myself in this community for the purpose of building relationships. And out of the logic of building relationships, perhaps new possibilities emerge that couldn't have happened. Now, I need to explain something, because what I just said doesn't make a bit of sense unless you know this. So as I voluntarily displace, okay, as I say, guys, I love you, I'm leaving town for a while, it's not random. It's not like any place will do. The spiritual compass of my displacement is the same spiritual compass that characterized Jesus's, if you will, map. And that spiritual compass was, where am I needed? Where has love been blocked in the world? Where is compassion begging to go? Where are the voices of my brothers and sisters crying out because of neglect or abandonment or marginalization or woundedness? Where are the cries of the poor? And that's what steers my steps. Now, I don't come here and say, you guys are so lucky, I'm here to save you. Right? That's not it. It's like, well, the guy from the wealthy neighborhood has shown up and he's going to solve all your problems. Nope. All I do is I plop myself down and begin to build relationships and hear voices and share stories and learn how to love. And then out of the logic of relationship, then perhaps conversations emerge about what are their hopes and dreams of this community and how can I be helpful. Are you with me? Now, what's brilliant about this? I mean, there's 1,000 things that are just so good. Number one, it looks a lot like Jesus. But number two is, instead of sort of talking about issues, so if I say immigration, everybody already divides up into camps. But if I say displace yourself, go to the places where the wounds are. Let's presume that there might just be a few cries of the poor in the immigrant community, right? And I put myself over here, and maybe I carry an opinion with me. I am human, right? I ain't perfect. But anyway, I go over here and I just maybe keep my opinions to myself, and I say, and then I begin to hear the stories. And maybe the stories are something like this, because they often are. I don't have papers. And I came across the border because my kids are starving. I can't get a job because all the jobs I used to have got sent to China. You know, it was called CAFTA. These are real stories. These are real. I mean, and I could just sit there and watch my children starve, and so so I'm drawn in, and now I have to figure out, what does it mean to be Christ here, right? So the encounter. In other words, I get displaced. I have an encounter, an encuentro. And it changes everything. And so you think about the Good Samaritan story, right? Who is neighbor? Well, you create neighbor by putting yourself present. Now, so you see the feel of this. The call of discipleship is not the call to have the right opinions about issues. The call to discipleship is to be the bridge between, if in some ways, communities, to be a bridge between darkness and light, to be a bridge between what I know and I don't know, to be a bridge between those who've been left behind and maybe those who have more than they need. That's the bridge. I become that, you see. That's in some ways, sometimes it's called the third way. You know, the first way is run, the second way is hate, and the third way is build a bridge. And so we're building bridges. So that's a little piece of lexicon you need to know about the Pope's language here. Any questions about this? Isn't it just, I mean, you think about it too, when Jesus calls the disciples, I'm going to say this a little bit later, how does Jesus call the disciples? Like this. It's actually, look at it. It's a call to the road. Jesus doesn't say, let us spend 6 blissful years around a plastic table and 13 plastic chairs. Study this until we get it all right. And when we have all the right knowledge, we will all assume into heaven. It ain't that at all, is it? It's invited into a healing presence of compassion and mercy and forgiveness. It's not sit around the table and get it right. In other words, we're formed. I mean, if we use the gospel model here, it looks like we're formed on the road. Does that seem right to you? And the Pope Francis takes this very seriously, right? That we're not only talking about how can I be helpful over here, but how do I craft a soul for myself? How do I become a whole person? And yes, you know what happens? I'm connected here, and I'm still connected to home. This is still home base for me. Everybody get it? You see out the snapshot. Okay, so let's go on. Let me hear if a male voice would read this next text for us. Just jump in. Just jump in.
Vatican II and Pope Francis. I dream of a missionary option that is a missionary impulse capable of transforming everything, so that the Church's customs, ways of doing things, times and schedules, language and structures can be suitably channeled for the evangelization of today's world, rather than for her self-preservation.
So you see that little nudge at the end. But the last thing the Pope's interested in is a church that just hunkers down and keeps all of its members untouched by the outside world, and so this missionary option, the missionary option for the local church. And what's it going to do? It's just going to transform everything. What's not included in everything? That was a funny way to ask the question. But anyway, nothing, right? Everything changes, right? So when you become if you will, a community of faith who doesn't just do this, right? Come to mass, or come to church property. That's where all the action is. And in fact, what we realize now is it's where some of the action is, but this is connected to this, right? The sending piece. So what happens to parishes when they are as focused on preparing people to go out there as they are in trying to get them in here? Are you with me? And so we begin to look like what? Some of these, anybody know the Jesuit Volunteer Corps? Right? These are young people after college who spend a year or two in a poor place, either in this country or abroad. And if you get involved in JVC, Jesuit Volunteer Corps, what happens? You're prepared, and then you're sent, and you come back. And I think that's sort of the model of in other words, what a big part of church will be preparing every one of us for the going out. Now it won't necessarily be to Venezuela. It could be just across town. But we will be equipped. How can you equip me so that when I come to that side of town, I'm prepared for what does it mean to talk in some perhaps across economic background divides? What does it mean to talk across a racial boundary? What does it mean to think about how do we solve poverty and not just dabble, right? I mean, I'm all for making sandwiches and pass them out on the corner, but at the end of the day, that doesn't stop the despair. So I think we want to be equipped to think about what does it mean to heal this place, not just dabble on the edges. Are you with me? The parishes will become a place that still is drawing people in. It's going to have fabulous liturgies. We're going to have great prayer. We're going to build community. We're going to celebrate until the cows come home. But we're also doing all this in the name of being light and leaven for the world, right? We're being prepared to do the work that needs to be done out there. So we're going to have to get pretty sophisticated with our religious education. Okay, how about another woman's voice for the next text from the Pope?
The renewal of structures demanded by pastoral conversion can only be understood in this light, as part of an effort to make them more mission-oriented, to make ordinary pastoral activity on every level more inclusive and open, to inspire in pastoral workers a constant desire to go forth, and in this way to elicit a positive response from all those whom Jesus summons to friendship with him. As John Paul II once said to the bishops of Oceania, all renewal in the church must have mission as its goal, if it is not to fall prey to a kind of ecclesial introversion.
Ecclesial introversion, how do you like that? Like a pretty clear image there of what he's trying to work against. I have a lot of interest in this particular quote, but the one I'll just emphasize right now is that very at the top of the page, the renewal of structures. What the Pope is hoping for is a renewal of structures, not just this. And this has been, I think, partly the Church's tradition. You know, we hope maybe a few of you, like the Green Beret version of Catholicism, will commit yourselves to going to Haiti, and the rest of us will fund you and clap. That's not it. What he's really talking about is how do we, quite frankly, redo the plumbing of the Catholic parish so that we get different outcomes. And everybody assumes that I have a part to play in healing this world. And I'm happy, excited, passionate, committed to doing it. Does that sound right to you? Yeah. Okay, how about one more male voice?
The parish is not an outdated institution precisely because it possesses great flexibility. It can assume quite different contours depending on the openness and missionary creativity of the pastor and the community. While certainly not the only institution which evangelizes, if it proves capable of self-renewal and constant adaptivity, it continues to be the church living in the midst of the homes of her sons and daughters. This presumes that it really is in contact with the homes and the lives of its people, and does not become a useless structure out of touch with people or a self-absorbed cluster made up of a chosen few.
You got little zingers that all doesn't pull any punches. Well, my interest in this particular text, besides just it stands on its own, but just let me highlight something for you as you think about, for those of you involved in parish leadership, either because you're a pastor or you're on staff, you're on the parish council, or you're on a committee. Look at these words. The third line, openness. The fourth line, creativity. A couple of lines down, self-renewal. And then adaptivity. If you think the Pope is inviting something new to happen, and in some ways giving license to communities or leadership and the community to begin to experiment with what would empower this community to be light and leaven in the world. I mean, in some ways, we've never done this before as a parish. There's lots of templates. We have religious communities, Sisters of Mercy, Sisters of Charity, the Jesuit. I mean, there are a lot of traditions where we could borrow to begin to experiment. And we have a lot of agencies, CRS, Catholic Charity, St. Vincent de Paul. There's a lot of agencies that give us some, but this is a time for some creative thinking, some fresh thought. And my brothers and sisters, let me just say this. The loss of young people in the church, between ages of 18 and 41, the precipitous, I can't say it any stronger, the precipitous decline. The absence of young people, unless, what's that phrase? Insanity, best definition of insanity, keep doing the same thing, expecting something else to happen. I don't, something new something fresh has to happen. And it's not just because, like it's a new time and let's be up with the fads. I think what we're being called to is a reclaiming of our Jesus tradition. And we're asking the parish to take seriously the invitation of Jesus, to do what Jesus does, and not just in some ways to worship the Jesus who did it. And finally, I'll read this one. We must admit, though, that the call to review, this is where the Pope is talking about Vatican II, we must admit, though, that the call to review and renew our parishes, a la Vatican II, has not yet sufficed to bring them near to people, to make them environments of living communion and participation, and to make them somewhat mission-oriented. I'm sorry, mostly mission-oriented. No, that isn't it either. Completely mission-oriented. Completely mission-oriented. Completely mission-oriented. This is the Pope. Isn't it just stunning? I mean, and exciting? And compelling, it seems to me? So let me offer these sort of reflections on the Pope's thoughts. I know he says he invited creativity, so I said, well, I guess I'm invited, I'll do it. So these are my thoughts. And, maybe I'm wrong, but so here's how I think about, in some ways, the transition from Vatican I to Vatican II. Now, you notice it doesn't say from to, it says from to also. In other words, this is something to build on. Right? So, number one, how to equip people to be part of the sanctuary or the gathering space. So we have sacramental prep, we build community, we do prayer. We're constantly inviting people to the sanctuary to learn how to pray, to build community, to learn their tradition. All good stuff. And, I think, to move to Vatican II means how do we equip people to heal and make holy the world. So, but back to my point. When we equip people, we equip them for the tasks ahead. So if somebody's going to deal with the problem of homelessness in Cincinnati, what are the skills they need? Who do they need to be talking to? Who are the smart people who talk about homelessness in the Cincinnati area and can talk about what does a vision of a real healing of homelessness look like? You see? That would be happening in churches, not just at the nonprofits around town. It'd be happening in churches because this is where the biggest volunteer base in the whole city is, in churches. By a mile! Right? It's great! But there's so much power in our churches, it's just overwhelming. Sorry. My wife says, Jack, you may not be right, but you sure are loud. So from religious education and spiritual formation, focused on life on church property, inner realities and home, all that's good, right? It's good to have home base, right? It's good to be loved. It's good to be connected. And religious education also focused on the reality around us, like Laudato Si'. Like the Pope has given us a little template here, right? As people of faith, what do we got to be attentive to? Among other things, coral reefs, air. I mean, the great Franciscan tradition, where Francis talks about air, the water, the sky, the sun as kin, right? Brother, sun, sister, moon, they're kin to us. And in fact, they are. We're all made of stardust, as it turns out, right? So, okay, on we go. From the parish, local church, the small faith community as a place of the pastoral care of its members. That's a good thing, right? If somebody gets sick, 57 people show up at your hospital bed, that's a good thing. But also, the parish, local church has a place of prophetic urgency for the poor and the vulnerable who may not be part of the parish or the neighborhood, right? The very simple answer, the gospel answer to this question, the question is, who is my brother or my sister? And the gospel answer is, everybody. So, who is part of my people? Everybody. And so, that's what we're called to. From the church renewal, emphasizing belonging to a place and a people. I'm thinking here, some of these programs like Amazing Parish, and what's the other one that's been real popular lately? But they're very popular. Millions of people. And they're largely focused on how do I improve the gathering of people in my church. Well, that's fine. I'm all for improving. If smiling at the door is I'm all for smiling. I like it. And if Better Donuts helps, go with Better Donuts. But and if better preaching makes the liturgy better, I'm all for it, right? And this notion of church renewal as empowering the community to transcend my home base. I love being here, but I want to be part of a spiritual tradition that sends me from the familiar into the unfamiliar. In the name of healing the world, I'm all for it. You can craft it however you want. I'm for that. From evangelization as a way of getting people to the sanctuary, I'm going to evangelize you to get you to my church, right? But how about evangelization as a way of engaging people in the meaning and missional geography and care of Jesus, to be with everybody? In other words, back to that image. When Jesus evangelizes people, right? So let's go. Let's go. You'll understand about God when you come this way. So isn't it interesting that, for example, when we take young people on what's sometimes called mission trips, they think they're going to some exotic place, they're all excited because they're going together, and there's some girl that some guy likes a lot, so she's going, I'm going. But anyway, so they go for all sorts of reasons, right? And then they go and they have this experience, and they step off the plane, in some cases, Haiti or someplace, and they stop and they look at each other like, why did we come here? And now the catechesis can begin. Because we're in the desert. So, this notion of calling people in some ways geographically as a way of actually forming them as Catholic, as Christians. Church going, we talked like, where do you go to church, right? But I'd like to change the language. Where is the church going this week? Right? And when I mean that, I mean, where are we? Where are the places we're touching this week? Whether it's across the ocean, or right next door, or across town, or whatever it is, where is the church going? So just the play on the words, church going in two different directions. Tithing and church budget primarily focused on church building and on-campus activities, as opposed to tithing and church budget focused outward on addressing scarcity and need of the world. So occasionally I bump into churches and parishes say, we give 10% of everything we take in to those who are poor. And I say, well, how come it's not 50%? Meaning, and I'm not trying to be a crab, but when you look at the mission of Jesus, it's not, it's not like I'm roaming the countryside doing a little bit of, charitable giving. I'd like to see if you'd give that so we could build the temple bigger. Right? The rich young man comes to Jesus, says, what must I do to inherit everlasting life? Jesus says, sell all you have, give it to the poor, and then come and follow me. Now, whatever you think of that text, it doesn't speak to building fund too much. Now, look, the point is, this is still important. It's really important for the community to have a place to gather. Period. It's important that the roof does not leak. Period. I'm all for it. But I'd like to suggest that the balance of our focus on ourselves versus the focus out there just be a little bit more balanced, right? And in another place, I've argued that it ought to be 50-50. Period. From prayer and discernment in the sanctuary, this is the way we think about it. I hear this all the time. I need to pray. I need to pray and discern, and then when I've got it, and I'll go off to the monastic, retreat house to do that, and then after I've got it figured out, then when I'm holy, near the beatific vision, then I'll do something out there. Then I'll know what to do. Yeah, well, that sometimes works. But I want to suggest that just as potent is prayer and discernment in the streets, when, for example, people cross town and they get on their knees and they've seen children who don't have access to decent housing, a good education, and sometimes not even adequate nutrition. And they get on their knees and they ask God, Lord, what do I do? And sometimes the answer is very simple. Help me heal this place. And it's much more obvious there than it is on the 17th tee. Right? I mean, in other words, one of the problems with surrounding ourselves with a buffer of comfort is it's sometimes hard to hear the gospel call when you're so comfortable. Like, what do I do at the country club? Well, smile at the person who brings you your margarita. It's not ample. I mean, yes, smile, of course smile, but it's not enough, right? And sometimes we don't realize the oomph of the gospel if we've simply located ourselves in sort of the barren places. And the barren places are not the poor community. The barren places is the country club. That's the spiritually barren place. And I'm a son of wealthy parents. I'm not taking pot shots at anybody. It's just that spiritually, it's not a rich place. Assumption that people move from prayer to action, true, and also the assumption that people move from action to prayer. That is also true. In fact, a lot of people learn how to pray in the middle of the desert, right? They learn how to pray when they're confronted with realities that are just overwhelming to them. Both are true. It's just that we want to admit that both are true. That maybe one of the best ways to get people to learn how to pray is to put them in places where it's asking a lot of them and they realize that their well is maybe not deep enough to take it on. So I'm going to have to develop a deeper well, or acknowledge the one that's there and tend to it. Right? How about this? So my mother's Catholicism was this: come to Mass every Sunday. But if you're really holy, come to Mass every day. Right? Come to confession once every 3 months. But if you're really holy, every week. Like, oh, why are you here again? Anyway, if you're a good Catholic, you're going to spend a lot of time here, right? And that's my mother's Catholicism. Then just look at Mother Teresa, because she's a road woman, right? Her ministry was on the streets, right? And so Mother Teresa's care and attention is to those on the streets. Now, so we got this is kind of contrived, but I'll just say it this way. So you got my mother's sanctuary Catholicism, you got Mother Teresa's road Catholicism, and then I could ask this question: was Jesus a sanctuary guy or a road guy? Just look at the Gospels. He's always on the road. Now, does he have a proper respect and attention to prayer and the sanctuary? Absolutely. Does he spend most of his time there? No. No. So, for those of us who want to follow Jesus, where are we going to go? I mean, literally, I'll play Jesus for a moment. If you're going to follow me, where are you going to go? Right? On the road. Leadership. Leadership as caretaker of people in the church block or the spirituality center, that's a good thing. And leadership, how about this? As caretaker of God's world and the leader of the people who want to heal it. A new definition for pastor. Right? The orchestra leader. The orchestra leader of the great symphony called compassion. Right? And I think to myself, if a newly named bishop wanted to say, like, what do I do next? I think, just do what Francis does. Every time there's a wound, just show up. Right? Every time there's a drive-by shooting, show up. Every time there's a tragedy, show up and pray and be with people. Right? People would love you as the bishop if you just, right? Who doesn't love Francis? I know there are some, but I don't think it's fair. The parish church and sanctuary is a hangout, but also the parish and church as a launching pad. The reason I hang out here, because we love each other so much, is like we're going to empower each other to our best selves. And that means, we've got this strong base of love. Send me to a place where that love is so needed. Right? All we're talking about really is tenderness in the world. That's the way Francis talks about it. Just how do we be tender people? How do we be tender people? And how do we care for a world that just knows an awful lot of struggle and pain? Year of Mercy is a study of mercy. Good, great. I was thinking Pope Francis found out that there were, and I don't think this is true, but there were 17 good Catholic PhD students getting their PhD in the study of mercy. I think he would say great. And then if he found out, and this might be true, that there were 275 parishes studying mercy in a 6-week course at their parish, I think that would be great. But what would really make him happy is that if all that study and whatever else was happening would actually yield people practicing mercy, because that's the point. Okay, and then finally, this lovely photo of the Pope doing, walking the talk, right? Have you noticed wherever the Pope goes, the first thing he does, he goes to the most wounded place he can find. Even the first trip he took off the campus of the Vatican, the very first international trip he took was to Lampedusa. It's a place where migrants from Africa try to get to on boats, much like people from Cuba trying to get to Miami, except that 20,000 have died trying to get there over the last decade and a half. It's an awful, and that's the first place he goes to, and he weeps. And actually, while he's there, he says this: our distraction has robbed us of our ability to weep. Our distractions have robbed us of our ability to weep. We can't care anymore because we're so distracted by other things. So that's the vision. Now I'm going to pass this off to Tim in just a second. But so if you want to know what Just Faith does, Just Faith Ministries does, we just try to create tools that help people develop an appetite to be voluntarily displaced. And by voluntary displacement, let me be clear here. I'm not talking about everybody going to Haiti. I'm talking about the work of compassion, which will probably require of us to get out of our office, probably out of our homes, and into the lives, connecting ourselves with the lives of others, whether it's nearby, the neighborhood, across town, you know, in another county or whatever it might be, and in some ways put ourselves in those places so our love can be made useful. And what Just Faith does is it provides people a robust opportunity to look at the scriptures, to look at church teaching, to look at some of the great witnesses of holiness, to look at some of the wonderful agencies that have translated this love into practical effect. For example, like Catholic Relief Services, which, you know, does extraordinary things overseas. And then gives them a chance in some ways to build community. It involves lots of good reading. Notice I said lots of good reading, and the emphasis was on good, not lots. It involves some video, it involves a lot of good prayer, it involves 2 retreats, it involves 4 immersion experiences where you actually put yourself in a place where you can hear the voices and see the eyes of those who've been kind of pushed aside. And the hope is that by the time the process has been completed, something has happened. We sometimes describe our work as transformative education, which is a hope, not a guarantee, right? Who can put the Holy Spirit in a bottle? But the good news is that we do have this stack of testimonies of people who've been through the process and have had their lives kind of nudged in the direction of those who needed them. And they report not only that their lives were changed, but they're glad, even as hard as it was, that they're glad. And so sometimes I say this, that my brothers and sisters, it may be that the richest part of our tradition in some ways is the most challenging. Well, there's no surprise in that, is there? Of course, of course. Okay, where did Tim go? Oh, there's Tim, over here. Is that you okay? So now, what we're going to do now is we're going to lock the doors, and if you want to get out, you're probably going to have to sign something.
I'm mandatory. There are on this back table here, can you hold them out? Sure. Flyers and clipboards for the programs that we're going to be starting through the parish. We are trying to start 2 of the large groups that Jack mentioned, 24-week commitment, one on Sunday afternoons and one on Thursday evenings. And so putting your name there is really just saying, have someone contact me with more information. It's not saying I'm in, but it's saying I'm discerning. So if you can think about it even, put your name there and someone on our planning team will contact you. The other piece that we're doing is for those who feel like 24 weeks might be not where they're at right now, we're doing 2 8-week versions. One is focused on immigration, called Crossing Borders, and one is focused on mass incarceration, called the Church of Second Chances. And those dates and times will be sort of determined by the interests and timing of the groups themselves. So if you're interested, back there. The other piece, which Mac is going to remind me if I don't say it, everyone here, especially alumni, can invite others into this process, can help us recruit. You can say, I don't want to do this alone, but I'll do it with my friend. Or, I don't want to do this alone, but my partner wants to do it. So encouraging others into this process, I think, is very helpful. So please look at your networks and invite others into this as well. The other last thing, if we don't have the full groups by September 18th, the cap is 12 people per group. We will be having discernment meetings after each of the masses for people who are still uncertain about what they want to get into. So September 18th, which is the week before we start, we will be doing discernment. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Jack, for that.